not preaching on the gospel lesson this morning. Yeah. As a preacher, one of my favorite things to do, actually, is give children's sermons. Most pastors I know will tell you that they dread it, that they are happy to hand the chore off to a seminary intern or their associate pastor or pretty much anybody just passing by who doesn't say no. But I love it. It's wild and woolly, and it's completely unpredictable. It's usually hilarious, and yet sometimes it's so poignant it can bring you to tears. Now, a lot of the craziness comes from the moments when the preacher asks the children a question. And that's often a part of children's sermons, right? You want them to interact with you. But you just never know what they're going to say when you throw a question out there. Like the time at my mother's church when the pastor asked the children to name some of the 10 Commandments. And, you know, they got some of the big ones. And then right before he wrapped it up, one little boy stood up, leaned right up next to the microphone and went, "Thou shalt not admit adultery." Or like the little girl who, when her minister asked, "Why should we be quiet in the church?" she said, "Because people are sleeping." Most children's sermons include a visual aid or a prop of some sort. I think it's one of the reasons that adults will often say they remember the children's message more easily than the message of the sermon for grown-ups. And Jesus understood this, right? He knew that using a simple object from everyday life, like a lost coin, or a mustard seed, or a loaf of bread, makes complex ideas somehow easier to communicate and think about. Amos, who was an Israelite prophet that lived about 750 years before Jesus, he understood this too. In today's reading from the Hebrew Scriptures, we hear Amos use the image of a plumb line to describe how God determines if society is measuring up to the divine standards of compassion and justice. And I imagine, given that we have some carpenters in the room, that somebody here knows what a plumb line is. Anybody? Yeah? Yep. I knew Joe would raise her hand. I knew it. So it's plumb, P-L-U-M-B, not plum like the fruit. It's a simple tool. It's actually been used for thousands of years. They think even that the Egyptians used it to help when they built the pyramids. It uses gravity to establish what is plumb. That is something exactly vertical, true, perfectly straight up and down. And it consists of two simple things: a heavy weight, it's usually made out of something like lead or steel or brass. That's called the bob, and a string. Now, the bob is pointed on one end, and the string is tied to it and then attached up above to some scaffolding usually, so that it hangs. And the weight has to be able to move freely. You can't try to force it. You have to just let it hang there. And when it stops, the point of the bob is pointing at the spot on the floor that is directly below the spot where the string is fixed above. It makes a perfect vertical line to the floor. So the people doing the building project mark that spot on the floor, and as the building goes up, the string is extended longer and longer and longer, and the point of the bob is kept fixed, pointing at that mark on the floor. In fact, if you go to many ancient cathedrals or domes or towers, you will still see brass marks in the floor that mark the absolute center of the structure that's above your head. Now, I brought along a plumb line today, so for those of you who don't know what one is or have never seen one, that's all it is. Now, because the string I used is twisted, it won't stop spinning. Believe me, I've waited, and it just keeps spinning back and forth, back and forth. But that's a plumb line. That's all there is to it. And it's what Amos used as his prop, as his visual aid when he was talking to Israel and making his prophecy. He was good at communicating what was a very complex idea about God using something simple, like that tool, a heavy weight suspended from a string. But despite his talent for using visual aids, Amos would not be anybody's first choice to give a children's sermon at any church. He was a harsh and angry man who was sick and tired of the hypocrisy and the abuse and the corruption and heartlessness that he saw in the wealthy, prosperous society around him. And Amos was not afraid to tell it like it was. I think he wasn't afraid because it was God himself who called him to preach a word of judgment against Israel, to speak truth to power, to condemn the ways his people had strayed away from God's law of love and justice. Did you hear him tell Israel today, that conversation he'd had with God? The Lord said to me, "Go, prophesy to my people Israel." And then the Lord said, "See, I am holding a plumb line in the midst of my people. I've spared them for the last time. This is it. Israel's shrines will be knocked to pieces. I will raise a sword against the royal family, and Israel is going to be handed off into exile far from home. You had better listen to this, you who walk all over the weak, you who treat poor people as less than nothing, who give little and take much. You exploit the poor, using them, and then when they're used up, you discard them. These are the words of God," said Amos. Yeah, he's probably not the guy you want to invite to your next dinner party, and he's definitely not the guy you want giving a children's sermon next Sunday at church, because he was a man on a mission, sent by God to deliver some very bad news. Israel was not measuring up, and God was about to inflict a harsh judgment on them. Now, at the time that Amos first received God's call to deliver this hard message, Israel was experiencing unprecedented prosperity. Times were good, at least for the wealthy elite. King Jeroboam had become popular by expanding Israel's territory through very aggressive military tactics. Even Amos himself had apparently been making a pretty good living as a dresser of sycamore trees. This means that until God came along with the prophet assignment, Amos had spent his days cutting open the fruit of sycamore figs. This has to be done, you see, when you're a dresser of sycamore trees, to see if the tree is healthy and if everything's all right inside. You slice open the female fruit because that helps with the ripening process. And the male fruit, which is not edible on a fig tree, I did not know that until this week, has to be sliced open because, and this is a little gross, there is a wasp that is essential to this tree's pollination process that plants its eggs inside the male fruit. And you have to slice it open so they can get out and go about their pollinating business. I know, right? Who knew? Now, as a prophet, Amos was called to kind of do the same thing for Israel, right? Slice it open and see inside what was healthy and what was not. And what he found inside his own society was not healthy at all, at least not according to God's standard, God's plumb line that measured how well they were living up to God's expectations, how straight and true the line was between the heart of the people and the heart of God. What God and Amos saw was that underneath all Israel's wealth and military victories was a people who had forgotten God's command to care for the poor, the defenseless, the least and last and lost of their world, which is, as you and I know, both Hebrew and Christian scriptures' message. It's what they make perfectly clear. The plumb line by which God always measures any society, Israel or any other one, is how well they provide for the most vulnerable of their neighbors, and how fairly they share the resources with which God has blessed them. So Amos says to his fellow Israelites, "They trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted away. They trample on the needy and bring to ruin the poor of the land. Their temples," he says, "they are good at making fancy rituals, but they don't change people's hearts or actions. And now it's judgment day, and there will be hell to pay." When we hear a text like that, and we talked about it in church school this morning a little bit, we can't help but wonder, well, what about us? How does it look when we put our society today beside God's plumb line? Do we measure up better than those ancient Israelites did? Is the line straighter between our hearts and God's than it was with theirs? Of course we'd like to think so, right? I mean, we've evolved since those days. We're more humane and compassionate than our ancestors. Well, I'm afraid that the U.S. Census Bureau and Harvard University and the University of California, among many others, have collected a whole lot of evidence that suggests we are in fact no better and are likely a whole lot worse. 13% of Americans live in poverty. That means more than 1 in every 10 people. And it's 1 in every 5 American children. 1 in every 5 American children live in poverty, and the number of elderly Americans living in poverty is increasing. On any given night in our country, more than 500,000 people, that's 553,000, or on average, which is just an average, 11,000 people for each of the states in the United States are experiencing homelessness. In the U.S., and we are the world's largest food exporter, there are 13.1 million households with children who often go without food. Especially now that school's out for the summer, right? Because school-provided lunch and breakfasts are often the only food that kids get on a regular basis. Income inequality, this really blew my mind. Income inequality is worse today here than it was in 1774, even after you fix the math for slavery. So even when you consider all the people that were slaves and had nothing, it's still worse today than it was then. The top 0.1%, not 1%, but 0.1%, 1/10 of our neighbors have as much wealth as the 90% of the rest of us do. And the gap between rich and poor just keeps growing faster and faster and faster. And of course, tangled together with all this is race, right? In our country, you have to talk about race when you talk about poverty. 22% of African Americans live in poverty. Only 8% of whites do. Black households earn $57.30 for every $100 that white folks earn. And I have another visual aid for you. So this is my paycheck for today, and in churches, this is going to blow your mind if you don't already know it. There are no secrets between you and me. You guys know what I get paid. So my paycheck today is for $1,100. Somewhere I have a black colleague who got her paycheck this morning at her church, and it was only for $630, even though she does the same job I do. That's what that math means. Visual aids, they're very handy. It's good that it was a payday. Thank you, Marilyn. No. No, I got to pay my bills tomorrow. And for every $100 that white folks have in wealth, like a house or a car or stocks or a retirement account, black folks have $5. 100 versus 5. And 60% of American prison populations are minorities. And yet, the United States has the world's largest economy. You'll often hear people say, and we're the richest country on earth. We're not. We're the 4th richest country on earth if you don't count oil-producing countries. And the 4 that are ahead of us are the 3 that are ahead of us: Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Norway. And some of Norway's money comes from oil, so maybe you could say we're 3rd. But Luxembourg and Switzerland are ahead of us, and obviously they're much tinier than we are. But we have the world's largest economy, and let's say we're the 4th richest nation on earth, and yet 1 out of every 5 of our children lives in poverty, and 13 million of our children don't get enough food to eat. We're the largest economy on earth and the 4th richest, and yet the concentration of wealth in the tiniest fraction of our upper crust is so huge it exceeds what the other 290 million of us have altogether. We're the largest economy and one of the richest nations, and yet in each of our 50 states tonight, thousands of people will go to bed in their cars or in emergency shelters in city parks or on sidewalks because they don't have a home. Or at the church, that's right. Yeah. Dory and Steve. And actually in Portland now, the shelters are so full, the churches are actually, people are sleeping at the church every night through Family Promise. So after you hear all that, and I apologize, we talked in church school this morning and Lily said, you know, we all of us, and I do the same thing, can't listen to the news for very long anymore because you get so anxious and so upset that it's hard to function the rest of your day. I used to be an NPR junkie. I listen from 6 to 6:10 every morning and turn it off because I can't take it. So I'm sorry that I brought all that news into worship this morning. But when you hear it, you think, uh-oh. It would appear that we, the people who've learned to use plumb lines so well when we make buildings, have forgotten about how to build ourselves, how to build our character, how to build our community. And like the Israelites before us, we failed to use God's plumb line to center ourselves and ground our efforts to align with God's heart and God's priorities. We've forgotten the most vulnerable among us, and that, God tells us, is the first clue that we're out of plumb, which means we're off center. We're in danger of leaning so far over, actually, we could collapse. The plumb line of our hearts and lives has too often been forgotten in the midst of all our wealth and worry. How is it that the perfection with which we construct our buildings is lost on the way we construct our lives and our society? See, God says, I've put a plumb line right in the middle of you. It's a reference point. It's an authority. But we've forgotten how to check, to see that all that we do measures up to God's expectations. And without that frame of reference, it's easy for our eyes to play tricks on us. We might not even realize we're out of alignment. We kind of look around at the world and think, we're doing pretty good. I have a friend who lives in a house that was built in 1924, and I swear every wall and every floor is out of plumb. And I've done this, you can take a marble and put it in the middle of any room in her house and it will roll to one of the corners. No, it's completely out of whack. But when you're in it and you don't know that about her house, your eye starts to trick you and you can think, well, that wall's straight, and then you base everything else off that, and actually if you took a level or a plumb line, you're way, way off. You need that rock solid line of reference, or you get further and further away from what's true. Now, get out that little piece of paper with the train tracks on it, and if you just glance at it super quick, which yellow line do you think is longer? If you just don't think about it, the top one, right? If you just let your eyes look at it and look away, the top one is longer. If you take your fingers and cover up the train tracks on either side of that bottom line and then look at the two lines again, you'll realize they're exactly the same length. Yeah, like across that bottom line so you don't see the train tracks, they're exactly the same length. And what this says about how we see things is that it matters what's around us. We see things in context and in relationship. And when we look at our attitudes and behaviors compared to what's all around us, they might seem right, unless we remember about that plumb line. We remember about that reference point. The problem is even worse than that, though. If we're standing in the equivalent of a crooked house with crooked walls and crooked floors and we're not using a plumb line, the compassion and justice of God starts to look like that's what's off base. That starts to look like what's wrong or crooked or unrealistic. Misguided and irrelevant is how we become if we only view ourselves and our surroundings without God's plumb line. A Baptist preacher from Australia calls our soup that we swim in here the decadence, greed, and hardness of heart in our workshop, consume, die culture. I think he's a distant relative of Amos, actually. But we, the disciples of Jesus of Nazareth, we're called to stop, and we're called to remember that we've encountered God's love. A love and grace that will hand itself over to torture and death rather than compromise our pathway to life in its fullness. And that's the only love worth measuring ourselves and our society against. One way for us as people of faith to remember that truth is to use the words and the stories of the biblical prophets like Amos and like Jesus over and over again as a plumb line to hold up to our lives and hold up to our society. But as any builder can tell you, a tool, no matter how good it is no good to you if it lays in your toolbox unused. And I wouldn't trust a builder who only took their plumb line out once a week on Sunday morning for an hour and the rest of the time built my house without using it. Would you? I wouldn't. So why on earth do we think we can do the same with God's plumb line and still do all right? We can't. It's only by constant reference that we can learn to see ourselves and our society the way God calls us to see, without letting our eyes be tricked by the crooked walls and floors that are all around. A plumb line. It's the simplest of tools. It uses the most basic force on our planet, gravity, to show us what is true, where a perfectly straight line between down here and up there is. Does using a tool that's simple make it easy to construct a cathedral dome? Of course not. The job is still challenging. It requires years of hard work and ingenuity. God's plumb line, also the simplest of tools. It too uses the most basic force in creation, which is love, to show us what is true, to show us where that perfectly straight line between what's down here and what's up there is. Does using the simple tool make it easy for you or for me to construct a life of faith or a society that's in line with God's priorities? Of course it doesn't. The job is challenging and requires a lifetime of hard work, of ingenuity, of faithful obedience, and fearless discipleship. The good news for us this morning, and every morning, is that God's plumb line, it became flesh and dwelt among us full of grace and truth, Jesus of Nazareth. And that plumb line became flesh to straighten out our perspective so that we can build a life and a world that's in line with perfect love. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.
After the sermon hymn is a little bit different than what